Good afternoon and welcome to the 33rd of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. These calls are held every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. My name is Scott Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today, the subject is COVID-19 and immigration. My guests are Carly Goodman and Camille Mackler. We are streaming on YouTube Live. You can also keep up with COVID calls via Twitter at US of Disaster. You can also hear the COVID calls recorded as podcasts. Just go to soundcloud.com and search for the COVID calls podcast. Please do help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and topics, and please do feel free to suggest yourself. Tomorrow on COVID calls, I'll be speaking with Don Kettle. Don Kettle is the Sid Richardson Professor at the LBJ School in the University of Texas at Austin, and he specializes in public management and public policy. He's an expert in federalism and disasters, and he's the author of the new book, The Divided States of America. So please join me for that tomorrow. As of today, there are 3,173,036 cases of COVID-19 confirmed globally, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. That's up from 3,094,829 cases yesterday. 1,030,487 of those cases are in the United States, up from 1,004,908 yesterday. There are now a total of 60,207 deaths from COVID-19 reported in the United States, up from 57,812 yesterday. I had a wide-ranging discussion yesterday with Mike and Scott, and I hope you heard it. If you didn't get a chance to, please do check out the COVID Calls podcast. Mike is the host of The Pulse on WHYY Radio, Philadelphia. Towards the end of our discussion, we talked about the importance of local media, especially at this time, a time of disaster, both in the sense of the impact of communities and the role local media plays in covering disasters at the local level or at the neighborhood level in big cities, but also as a watchdog of public corruption. And with that in mind, I want to ask you to mark your calendars for a special COVID calls May 14th, when I'll talk to two reporters from one of the most important local newspapers in America, the Beaumont Enterprise. This is a newspaper in Beaumont, Texas, in Jefferson County, Texas, and they cover that county and the surrounding counties and the cities of Beaumont and Port Arthur, Texas. On that day, I talked to Caitlin Bain and Jacob Dick, and I cannot say enough about the stories that they and their colleagues are breaking at this time about the challenges to that community. Jefferson County, Texas has the highest concentration of petrochemical plants in America. It's right there with Cancer Alley and the parishes of Cancer Alley in southern Louisiana. And this small newspaper is the only local paper there that covers the oil business, environmental justice, and the pandemic all at the same time. They have the kind of ambition that my friend Karen Gadbois, the editor of The Lens in New Orleans, does. And I hope you'll check out the Beaumont Enterprise and look at the stories that they've been breaking. If you're inclined, maybe send me some suggestions by email or on Twitter of other local newspapers or media outlets and journalists who you think are really crucial right now. Now, one of the most important local stories that's been covered in Beaumont Enterprise, and I think it's being covered around America right now by local as well as major news outlets, is the impact of COVID-19 on immigrant communities. And I wanted to learn more about that. And so that's why I invited my two guests today. And let me go ahead and introduce them. Carly Goodman. First, Carly is a historian of immigration, a writer, and a visiting assistant professor at Salle University in Philadelphia, where she teaches courses on global history and migration history. She's also a co-editor at Made by History, the Washington Post, where she edits daily commentary and analysis from the nation's leading historians. She's working on a book about the contemporary immigration restrictionist movement launched by John Tanton. My second guest is Camille Mackler. She's Director of Immigration Legal Policy at the New York Immigration Coalition. In her role, she works on crafting policy priorities relating to access to justice and right to counsel for New York's immigrant communities. She currently serves as the chair of the Protecting Immigrant New Yorkers Task Force, the chair of the New York State Bar Association's Committee on Immigration Representation, and she sits on the American Immigration Lawyers Association committees on consumer protection and unauthorized practice of law. Two very busy guests today, and I'm really glad that they could make time for this discussion. Carly and Camille, welcome to COVID Calls.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. Honored to be here.
So I'd like to remind people that you can get questions in real time. Please put them in the YouTube live chat, or you can tweet them at me. Just tag me at US of Disaster. So let's go ahead and get started. And I would like to start the way I've been starting all the calls by finding out how things are where you are. So maybe Carly, I'll start with you. Where are you calling in from, and how are things there?
Thanks so much. Again, thanks for inviting me to be part of this. I'm really honored to be on this panel, especially with Camille doing all of the amazing work that she's doing. I'm just a historian, you know, it's it doesn't feel quite as important as maybe what she's doing, but Scott, we know the truth. We know how important history is at a time like this. So I'm calling in from South Philadelphia. This is sort of the first moment all day I haven't been watching Disney films with my 3-year-old while I try to do my work on the sofa. I know that that's sort of small potatoes, but that's the context for where I'm coming from, which is just I've been, you know, working overtime, but my family is safe, and so we're having a lot of gratitude for that, and just coping with the upset of our, you know, the fabric of our lives.
What was the pace of shutdown at LaSalle? Was it on the same timeline as the other universities in Philadelphia?
We got the notice on the morning of Thursday, the 12th. You know, we've been joking about the periodization of recent US history and how, you know, you could really focus on any given week of the COVID pandemic and would find really riches to understand. So it was the Thursday before our spring break. We decided to sort of suspend in class courses. We had spring break and then we resumed. So this is our last week of courses. It's been incredible to see how well people have coped and the incredible work that students are doing and how thoughtful they are in the midst of all this. But it's really a challenging situation.
You know, that transition in the middle of a semester strikes me to have been very, very difficult. At Drexel, we were moving into finals week when we shut down. So we had a little bit of a break, but then we started our spring term online. So we had what seems now to me almost a self-indulgent 2 weeks to prepare for that transition. But right now we're seeing at midterm the extra amount of labor and stress for the students and the staff and the faculty. So thank you for sharing that perspective. Camille, let me turn to you. Where are you and how are things there?
I am in Brooklyn, New York. So, you know, just trying to make it work, but I have a 6-year-old, so we're doing the whole remote schooling thing. Not as many Disney movies, but you know, I've been in New York since 2001, and so I've been through many moments in this city that have, you know, 9/11, Sandy, a few others, and I'm always just in awe and inspired by the resiliency of New Yorkers and the compassion. You don't think we have a lot of it, but we actually do, especially for each other. And so the 7 p.m. clap on our balcony is sacred in our house, and we count down to it starting at about 2 p.m. And that just reminds me just what an incredible city I get to be a part of. And, you know, we're just seeing it fight back like always right now.
I had a conversation last week with Virginia Heffernan, the columnist for the LA Times, and she was describing something very similar to what you were just saying, Camille, that, you know, the density creates all sorts of problems for social distancing, and yet you really see, and I think this is true in Philadelphia too, this enormous attempt to be careful with each other. And, you know, in places which, at least in our popular culture, have reputations as being pretty tough towns, the pro-social outpouring right now is immense, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I go running in the park very early with a mask, but people smile and wave at each other. Never experienced that before, but yeah, it's.
Yeah, the social contract is strong in New York and Philadelphia right now, I
Mhm.
think. So let me Carly, I'm going to turn to you first. And actually, I want to start. You wrote a really tremendous piece in the Washington Post last week. The headline was President Trump's immigration ban has nothing to do with coronavirus. And I think this is the frame for the first part of our discussion today. I'm just going to give a little quote from this piece. You said, of course, immigration is not a vector for the spread of the coronavirus, which is already circulating within the country. And xenophobia only exacerbates the problem in dangerous ways. The president's rhetoric has already been linked to rising hate crimes and violence against Asian Americans, and continuing to cast foreign-born and non-white people as bringers of disease may further fan these flames. A full immigration ban could possibly limit the ability for the United States to recruit needed healthcare and agricultural workers, or make it impossible for families to reunite at a time when we especially need the people we love. So can you explain to us the context of this op-ed, and why draw the connection for us between the pandemic and President Trump's announcement last week of this immigration ban?
Yes. Thanks for the compliment. Again, I wrote it amid Disney Plus screenings all day with books strewn around our living room. But
If that's your method, stick with it, because it's a really great piece.
Well, I don't think that anyone who's been paying attention to immigration found any surprises in my analysis. I don't think it came as a shock. The night, as I was falling asleep the night before, we had this tweet that we were going to shut down all immigration. The actual announcement of the policy is something distinct from an absolute ban, but the idea was out there, right? He put out this idea that we needed to shut down all immigration, make immigration zero. And that just flagged something for me, which is that this has been the long-time goal of this restrictionist movement, to reduce legal immigration altogether. You know, and thinking about what effect COVID-19 has had on the administration's immigration policies, in many ways, very little, right? These are the policies that they have already been pursuing quite aggressively. Things like the Remain in Mexico policy. It's hard to imagine a more dramatic attack on the right to seek asylum. A few weeks ago, sort of this new policy to return asylum seekers who arrive at the border, something that the administration has been trying to do for several years. This suspension, regardless of what its actual impact turns out to be, and I think it will affect people's lives in a negative way. It will be harmful. They seized this opportunity to take an emergency moment and make something of it. This is a goal that has not had a lot of popular support: ending legal immigration, ending the immigration of the family members of Americans, ending the humanitarian refugee resettlement program and asylum. This is the opportunity to do it. And I think this rhetoric, as well as these policy choices, make an already quite dangerous situation for so many people more dangerous.
Camille, I know you're tracking what's going on in some quite specific spaces of this battle, like immigration detention centers, or following what's happening with immigration and customs enforcement. So are there specific things that the pandemic is enabling the administration to do that it could not do before this moment?
I mean, yes, I think it's more a question of they've been trying to do it all along, and now they're exploiting this crisis basically to push it forward even more when everybody else's attention and energy is diverted. And I couldn't agree with you more, Carly, on basically everything you just said. I mean, they have not slowed down the deportation machine, and they've exploited this to as much as possible. I mean, you spoke about the ICE detention facilities. The incarceration space as a whole has been a concern in this crisis, where we know that close proximity really feeds this highly, highly contagious virus. And so we've had this situation in New York, and an article just came out just an hour or two ago, actually, in BuzzFeed that really highlighted this, that was excellent, that we had transfers from our facilities in downstate New York to an ICE-run facility in upstate New York, ostensibly to put in more separation, right, to put in more distance between individuals, to allow for social distancing. It turned out that one of the facilities where the people came from was the first facility to have a confirmed case of COVID amongst ICE detainees. Then the receiving facility in Batavia, New York, then became, as of last week, had the highest rate of infection. But to mitigate it, they just transferred a whole bunch of people down to Texas, who now has the highest rate of infection. I mean, they're just sort of moving people around, right? The solution, honestly, would be release them. I mean, you could release them on ankle monitors, right? You could release them in a way that they're still on some sort of supervision, or they're not really free. But I mean, at the end of the day, let's also remember that we're talking about civil detention, that even individuals who are there with a criminal, with a criminal history, have served their criminal sentences already, and that no one, everyone's being deprived of liberty without access to counsel, without access to a speedy trial. And now at risk for their lives. And we're just hearing heartbreaking comments from detained individuals saying, I just want to go home. Like, people giving up on their cases, giving up on their fights against deportation because they just don't want to die in a US detention facility. And then those who have been ordered deported, who aren't being able to leave the facilities, and they just want to see their families one more time, and they're genuinely afraid.
What about in courtrooms themselves and in immigration courts? Same kind of situation?
Yeah, so after a lot of fighting, they finally agreed to, they being the Department of Justice, which, for those who aren't aware, the U.S. immigration courts are part of the Department of Justice. The judges are employees of the Department of Justice. And the immigrants, the government is represented by a lawyer. Immigrants can only have a lawyer if they can afford one, or they can find a nonprofit to take their case. And everybody was begging them to stop the hearings. I mean, an immigration court hearing on a good day is, pardon the New York analogy, but it's like taking the subway at rush hour, right? It's just so crowded, it's so packed. And for a long time, they were refusing to close down the hearings, and they finally postponed the non-detained hearings. So they're still going forward with the detained hearings. They're switching things around. They've had to close down court after court after court for a day, for 2 days, because people are testing positive for COVID. And I can tell you, out of all of the friends, I'm in New York City, right? So I know a lot of people who've had it, and I'd have to say about 80% of them have some affiliation to the immigration legal system. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. And actually, the American Immigration Lawyers Association put out a letter, I've never seen this before, put out a joint letter with the Immigration Judges Union and the union that represents the ICE attorneys, so opposing counsels plus the judges, all put out a letter imploring the Department of Justice to end these hearings, and they really didn't heed the call. And that's the top of the iceberg in terms of what's been going on wrong at the immigration courts. But you asked me, your initial question was, are they exploiting this? And that's one way that they're exploiting it. I mean, a woman who was arrested at the border with her child, detained in the South in a facility in Louisiana, had a hearing via video with a judge here in New York 2 weeks ago. She has no lawyer. She's fleeing gang violence. She was given 2 weeks to submit documents for a final hearing to listen to her asylum claim 2 weeks later. For judges, and with a judge who won't even get documents that she may submit, because there's no staff to take care of that.
So just so I understand it correctly, and I just want to make sure for those who are listening who may not be as familiar, when you say ICE, you're talking about,
I'm sorry, yes,
a part of the Department of Homeland Security. It's a federal agency. It's the Immigration and Customs Enforcement agency.
Right. And they act as,
right?
Yes. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
So ICE acts as both law enforcement and prosecution. So they're both the prosecutor and the police for immigration in the interior.
Okay. And in the courtrooms, so just to be clear, if the administration wanted to curtail, slow down, or even suspend ICE activities in this moment as a matter of public safety, they could do that. There's no law compelling them not to do that.
Yeah, no, absolutely not.
I mean, if public safety was a priority.
Yeah, right. So let's make that assumption. I would sort of articulate. I mean, because they're framing public safety differently, obviously. And the same for the Department of Justice. If they wanted to suspend what's going on in the immigration courts or pursue other methods, you were talking about video distancing or other distancing kind of protocols that could be used. They could do that, right? There's
Yeah,
nothing
and
requiring them to do things in this way at this time.
yeah, I mean, we've submitted a number of letters and we actually made motions directly to the courts to implement certain things. And we referenced, for example, the New York State court, obviously the one I know the best, right? The New York State court system has moved to an entirely virtual court system. Part of the problem is that the US immigration agencies are not very technologically advanced. There's never been electronic filing in immigration court before now or anything like that. So they were starting from, a disadvantage in that sense. But as far as I know, every court system in the country, including the federal courts, have moved to a virtual system. And some matters can't be heard that way. You can't have a jury trial, which is not an issue in immigration court. But there are definitely ways to do it. But I mean, the other problem, of course, right, is that lawyers, when you can't have a lawyer, it's impossible to meet and prepare a client when you're stuck at home yourself, when you may be watching Disney or handling like all the stresses of your own circumstances. You don't have access to files, you don't have access to clients, you don't have access to the facilities that you would need to prepare a filing, to develop a legal argument. I mean, the common sense decision would have just been to pause everything the way everything else has been paused, and they haven't done that, and it's created enormous stress and enormous concerns about the I don't want to say the erosion of due process because we were there before COVID, but I don't even know where we start to come back from this, when the stay-at-home orders left.
Carly, what about deportations right now? I mean, it seems that, and you've said and others have said that we're in a sense we're deporting and exporting COVID-19 in this moment.
It was one of the things that I had to cut from my piece, but there's this irony, right, that casting people coming in from outside as bringers of disease is so fraught and racialized anyway. It's also at stark odds with the reality, which is that the United States is an exporter of COVID. We've seen the stories, especially of people being deported to Guatemala and Haiti, I think Mexico, and I haven't seen as much about El Salvador and Honduras, but maybe that's just because they're not being reported. But these planes full of people who are ill are flying around the country from one detention facility to another, and then taken to countries that have very little in the way of ventilators and infrastructure to handle the outbreaks that that are likely to follow. So it's crazy.
It's pretty fascinating. I'd love sorry, if I can ask a question to the two of your perspectives. Because there's this pattern, right, in immigration of there's a problem in the US, we export it abroad. It just gets completely magnified, right, and worsened in these countries that were, without getting into the whole destabilization of, for example, the Central American regions. But nonetheless, it gets exacerbated in countries that don't have the resources to address it, even as much as the US does. And then it triggers migration back to the US. And there's this pattern, right? And I mean, we've seen it in other areas like gangs and things like that. But I mean, it feels like the exact same thing. I'd love to hear what you guys think about that. But.
It just seems like it's not a lesson that anyone has wanted to learn or to pay attention to, that the role of the United States in creating situations that make staying home impossible. You referenced the problem with gangs, which we can link in many ways to the deportations of the 1980s and the 1990s, where a problem that we incubated here in the United States is again. So it's exactly the parallel situation that I was thinking of as I've been watching the news of these deportations in the last few weeks. But we don't seem to have like a political conversation about this that ever takes those important historical facts or context into account. That's sort of missing from the way that the public discusses immigration in the United States, like it's something that happens to us, but that of people coming from the outside in, when the United States is present in the world, right, and creating a lot of these destabilizing situations.
Oh, I want to remind people that you're listening to COVID Calls, and today we're talking about immigration and COVID-19 with Carly Goodman and Camille Mackler. I want to come back to, one of the findings, and I guess it seems now almost intuitive, but it's a relatively recent area of research and disaster research, is to not talk about disasters as a monolith, but actually to talk about disasters as revealing the underlying vulnerabilities in society. And we've talked on COVID calls about what that means in terms of race and African American communities in Cancer Alley in Louisiana. And now we have this executive order last night from the president, demanding that as a matter of national imperative, that meatpacking, the logistics, the supply chain of meat has to be kept open. And of course, that puts us into a discussion about labor and about immigration. And so I wonder if we can turn to that now. Maybe Camille, you first could give us your take on this executive order, or more generally, when we talk about this disaster in the communities that it hits. Of course, the immigrant community, we can say that, but when we go a little bit closer into that, we're really talking about specific workplaces in many cases, right?
Yeah, I mean, immigrants don't do the jobs that, you can work from home, or, I mean,
Right.
or offer those protections. And they can't access a lot of the social safety benefits, social safety nets, excuse me, that help in these sort of situations. I mean, in many ways, immigrants do the jobs that allow the rest of us to stay home, right? In New York City, that's very obvious. We've seen this sort of correlation between the epicenter of the epicenter is our immigrant communities, is places in Queens and such, which are very high in immigrant families. And it's no surprise, right? Because of all the jobs that they do. But even when you talk about the food supply and right, we all know who's picking fruit in our fields. I mean, who's milking cows in the dairies, who's packing meat in these meat packing plants. It is immigrants by and large. And they work in these terrible conditions. They conditions that are unsafe, especially in this instance, again, when the recommendation is to be far away from people and to sort of self-isolate, right? It's not just standing 6 feet away from someone. It's not touching the same surfaces. It's not being in the same space. It's not sharing the same equipment or things like that. And to top that all off, and like I said, immigrants don't benefit, right? They can't get a lot of the assistance. They've been left out of the stimulus packages. They've been left out of any sort of relief that's out there, that's being put out there at the state or federal level, at least in New York State. But then on top of which, in February, the Trump administration enacted a new rule that has basically terrified immigrants from seeking healthcare, because in a lot of times, if you get publicly funded healthcare, such as Medicaid, or if you take other benefits such as food assistance or cash assistance or anything like that, then you could be ineligible to get a green card down the road, and you could, in certain circumstances, be deported. And they did say early on in the crisis, well, early on, in mid-March, that anyone who sought medical help for COVID-related symptoms would not be held to this rule. But the overarching message was, don't take Medicaid, don't seek public help. It's going to put your immigration status, your livelihood here in the US in danger. And so that's been huge, right? That's been a huge problem for us. Sort of trying to get the communities to get the healthcare that they need so that they stop the community spread. Because at the end of the day, the virus doesn't care who you are, what your status is, right? It's going to infect whoever's standing there. And so it's really astounding that this administration, at least where immigration is concerned, has done everything to promote community spread at a time when the rest of us are desperately trying to prevent it.
There's this cruel irony here, and I don't know, Carly, if you want to address this, that these industries, which are now being seen as absolutely essential to the survival of the disaster right now, meatpacking, for example, by this executive order, agriculture, home health care, as well as all of the different, labor that goes into keeping facilities open and running, even when most people are not in those facilities. How is it that labor is so invisible in our society that we can basically, as Camille's describing it, sort of order immigrants to go into these environments where their risk of getting COVID and of dying is much higher than the rest of the population?
The vulnerability of immigrant workers and the invisibility of their labor are policy choices. right? These jobs that immigrants do, this category, is a policy choice. Employers have been incentivized to find more vulnerable workers who are less likely to join unions and to speak out against their poor working conditions. We had a tremendous piece last summer in Made by History, written by an anthropologist named Angela Stusa, who did ethnographic research in the communities in Mississippi, where the poultry processing had been basically all of the workers in those plants had been recruited as immigrants to replace African-American workers who had started to think about organizing in the 1990s. And so she tells this story very powerfully about how the idea that immigrants take jobs is really not evident in the historical record when we have records of employers seeking out and recruiting and choosing to employ immigrant workers by the very because of the fact of their vulnerability, because they're more flexible, I think is the word that Capital likes to use to describe this. And so not only has this been a policy choice, but the threat of deportation and violence that the enforcement machinery has created is part of that policy choice that keeps workers in a space of being less able to speak out, less able to organize for higher wages and better and safer working conditions, less able to, to follow in the footsteps of what Upton Sinclair was writing about in 1906 in these very same types of workspaces. So I forget what your question was, but to make it clear that this was not like an accident of history, but in fact, a very, aggressive policy choice that we've seen across industries. And the costs of that are mostly borne by the people themselves, of course, and their families and their communities. But we can see in a moment of pandemic that we're all very interrelated, and that you can't pretend that there's a wall between the inside of these meatpacking plants and us. The walls are porous. We rely on each other. We need each other. We need these supply chains, right? We want to make sure we still have healthcare workers and food. So immigrants are members of our community. Let's recognize that and make them eligible for things like COVID-19 relief, unemployment insurance. Yeah. It's absurd, right? That people who are members of our communities can't access the things that we all need to live.
Well, casting it as policy choices, to me, should feel very empowering for people who may feel quite distant from these battles somehow. That somehow it's taking place in a meatpacking plant off in Nebraska, or even in our own state in Pennsylvania or New Jersey or New York, but the policy choices around subsidy, around whether or not it's hard or easy for unions to organize, about occupational safety and health issues. Those are matters of public discussion and debate and the formation of policy. So let me drill down maybe a little bit more into this, Camille. Maybe first to you, are there particular industries here that are that rely more on immigrant labor and exploit that labor more than others that we see really right now under the glare of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I think when you have, immigrant workers are easy to exploit, right? Because they're not going to be as likely to go file a complaint or to sort of assert their rights, which then drives down the wage floor for everyone and sort of has a self-perpetuating cycle. I think let's start with an urban area, since we're in an urban area. Immigrants are the ones who clean our buildings, who clean our streets, who drive our cabs, who drop off our newspapers in the morning, who deliver our food, who work on our construction sites. In many places, immigrants are a disproportionate number of home health aides and individuals who sort of have to do, right, like care for our sick, for our elderly, day in, day out. If you start getting outside of the cities a little bit more, immigrants are in our fields, they pick our food. Like I said, here in New York, we have a huge dairy industry. they're the ones who milk the cows, who take care of the animals. They work, like you said, in the meat packing plants. They do all the little jobs that keep things running, right? So that others can come in and sort of like make the decisions and make the, the bigger management decisions. But they do all the little jobs that keep everything running. And also, I mean, they do, we haven't said this yet, but they're a big part of the medical system.
Right.
I mean, we were waiting for a Supreme Court decision on the fate of the DACA program, and they just filed supplemental briefing because 27,000 DACA recipients are healthcare workers. And they say that 1 in 4 healthcare worker in the United States is foreign born. And it's policy choices that just impact us over and over again, because they're developing a vaccine in Oxford, for example. What if one of the doctors that was educated in the United States but couldn't find a job here because our immigration system wouldn't let them stay, went back and becomes the one, right? I'm not saying that's going to happen. I have no idea, but it would be pretty, I mean, ironic, doesn't seem right, but it's possible.
It's an important context, because I think we're focused right now on the workers who are most at risk personally, their families and themselves, to being exposed, because they have to show up to work, or they don't work, and they can't use the health system for the many reasons you've said. But of course, there is an impact here as well for higher skilled workers.
Well, you should say higher wage.
I should. You're right. Exactly.
A lot of skill in building a house that doesn't collapse.
Yeah, no, I know. I was just thinking about what it would take to, plant and maintain our agricultural system, and I'm not qualified. So yes, absolutely. Yeah, higher wage. But be that as it may. Okay, so I'm going to leave that there for a second. I want to get to a question and then zoom this out a little bit. So I have a question here from Mike Fisher, who actually wants to sort of broaden this question a little bit. And he's wondering if you can speak to this issue of the larger organizations or forces that have been pushing for shutting down immigration. So kind of coming back to where we started, I mean, he says, beyond the generalized ideological conservative memes, there does seem to be a systematic, never let a crisis go to waste sort of ethos here. But at the same time, the big moneyed interests, these big industries that rely on immigration, they shouldn't want immigration to be cut off. Can you speak to this conundrum in American policy, that on the one hand, conservative forces seem to want to close the border, and on the other hand, it's those same moneyed forces that rely on that labor?
Yes.
Whoever wants to take that first. Yeah.
I think, well, we're going to see one fight about this play out on the right in terms of whatever comes up with the next immigration ban, because currently temporary worker visas are still going to be issued, especially for some of the lower wage jobs. And I know that infuriated many of the restrictionist groups that would truly like to see zero immigrants for their own sort of ideological and demographic project. There used to be some coalitions of sort of ethnic groups and business owners who could sort of collaborate and advocate for policies of more generous immigration. That's sort of what we saw in the 1960s and 1980s, and even in the Immigration Act of 1990, and even in the part of the 1996 bill, IRA, that stripped out the reductions in legal immigration. There was sort of a coalition of unlikely allies that sort of crushed that. What we've seen in the last 20 years, though, is that a highly militarized border has actually trapped people here instead of migrating more seasonally. It's created a sort of permanent population of people, but instead of giving people the legal status that could really help them and really help their communities, they've been criminalized, right? And so the enforcement mechanisms do serve the employers by creating this vulnerable workforce, by making them vulnerable to this overarching threat of deportation, of being dragged away from their children. And so there's some equilibrium here where some amount of restrictionism has actually served certain industries fairly well, right? while others, I think, primarily you see tech advocating for immigrant visas for high wage workers. It hasn't worked as well for them, right? So they're not monoliths, but I think that's part of the dynamic that has happened since the 1990s with the breakdown of those unlikely allies and coalitions.
I also feel like, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I also think that what's happened, frankly, for the last 3 years is that the American public has become much more aware of the state of our immigration legal system or immigration system than ever before. I think, the immigration laws are very convoluted, they're very complicated, and they're very limited, right? I mean, the question I get most often when I go into a space that's, more less immigrant friendly, let's put it that way, is why don't they follow the rules? Why don't they get in line? And then I just got to sort of start having the discussion of, well, they're trying, right? And there is no real line. And all these individuals you see coming to the border, they're not breaking their rules. They're exercising their right to ask for asylum. It's our system that has failed them by not providing the proper infrastructure to support it, not to mention support, what's happening outside of our borders so that the root causes can be addressed. But I don't know that it's always as ideologically divided as we seem to think. I think, if you take it away from the fringes, President Bush, W, in some ways pushed some better, some for businesses at least, right, some more immigrant friendly policies, whereas President Clinton signed IRA, which had devastating consequences for immigrant communities, and President Reagan before him signed an amnesty. And President Obama increased deportation. You know what I mean? Right. So like, it's not always as ideological as we think it is. And I think a lot of times, like when I go upstate New York and I talk to farmers, and they're not all terrible, right? I mean, it's not black or white, nothing's black or white. And oftentimes I'll go on the farms and people will say like, oh, well, I bet they're not paying anyone a decent wage. It's like, actually they are. They're paying them $15 an hour, even more, right? Like they take care of them in their own way. But the first question I get is, when are we getting laws that will allow our workers to come here? And, it's more about a following the rules. And so, which isn't to, soften anything that this administration has done. Like, just to be clear, what this administration has done is horrendous on every level. But I don't think it's always as black and white and ideological as we seem to think that, or as maybe, it seems to play out in the media and as we might think it is.
Yeah, I definitely was not talking about where public opinion is, but where the sort of, the policymakers or the Stevens Miller of the world, and how they're sort of battling things out behind the scenes in sort of the policy world. It's very different from how normal people understand the system, if they do at all, because it's, as you say, incredibly complex. And I think the complexity itself is a form of restriction. Public opinion has been incredibly positive, historic high opinion of how important immigration is to the United States, that has coincided with some of the most, draconian policy shifts, that I can remember, all taking place in the executive branch without any input from Congress or from the people.
I think that it's really interesting that you're both discussing a kind of a consensus. That word may be a little strong, but across party lines over the last multiple presidencies, trying to disentangle, as you said, a quite cumbersome and broken system, but with public opinion, you said, Carly, trending towards positive view of immigrants.
Yeah, I guess I would describe a kind of bipartisan anti-immigrant stance that has really dominated policymaking, since the 1980s. There's been, a few moments, elements of IRCA, things like that, that sort of trend against that. But in general, this has not been a partisan issue in the way that we think of partisan issues today. I think that has changed in the last 3 years, for the worse in many obvious ways. In other ways, it's opened up liberatory possibilities that I really didn't think would be possible, 4 or 5 years ago, seeing the way that the movement has pushed the Democratic candidates, maybe not today, but 6 months ago, on immigration issues. And as Camille pointed out, Trump has raised the visibility of this issue in ways that have been unbelievably harmful and dangerous, because he's, activating white nationalism, but also in ways that I think have caused a lot of people to be less passive about a policy arena that has long had the kind of violence that we now see daily in our Twitter feeds.
Yeah, I wanted to go in this direction because I think it seems that whatever Trump believes, and it's very hard to discern what he may actually believe, he bought into an idea that Steve Bannon had and others, that this was a political winner for him. Even though it seemed that it might go against some sort of mainstream American opinion, it was incredibly energizing to a dedicated base of voters in key states that he would be able to flip from Democrats. And maybe that indeed worked. But at the same time, I mean, Camille, you've seen, and I guess we've seen in many cities in 2017, the demonstrations at American airports. In my lifetime, I've never seen so much activism pushing against a president who was trying to criminalize or be blatantly racist in their sort of, or you used white nationalism as a term, Carly, and I don't think that's too far to go. Am I being too optimistic? I'm being too optimistic here. Am I being too optimistic here? What do you think, Camille? I mean, is this a moment of activism?
Yeah, I mean, so it's just to get a little personal for a second, you know, my organization organized a lot of the rallies and protests after the election. And then when the travel ban came, it was just at the end of just a gutting, exhausting week, right? It was the first week of the administration. We'd gotten the first 2 executive orders. We knew the Muslim ban was coming. We've been trying to figure out how to respond. We thought, you know, he went to Mar-a-Lago for the weekend. We were a little free on Friday until like 5 p.m. when we found out that it dropped. And then I remember talking to people in the government and asking what it meant. And they said, don't worry, it takes time. It takes time to implement, right? You need guidance. And so when I woke up on Saturday morning, and saw that it had gone into effect when people were midair, a few of us went out to the airport and drove out there. And as an immigration lawyer, I'm thinking, what am I doing? You're not allowed a lawyer at the airport. But all I could think of is there's families there, right, who are waiting for loved ones who aren't making it through. They must need help. And so we started texting people, we started calling people, and it grew into the protest that you saw. But what I'm trying to say is that we planned every single protest, right? We had something that Friday, we did this Juma in downtown Manhattan. Rosa Parks was planned. She wasn't even the first person to sit at the front of the bus, right?
Sure.
The airport protests were not planned. I assure you that driving to JFK that morning, it was neither my plan nor anybody else in that advocacy community in New York that had said to themselves, hey, if the travel ban goes into effect, we're all going out to JFK. It was like, there was just this moment of national recognition, and that day just will always stand out in my mind, because just like from standing in a parking lot and watching, you know, people just standing there singing "This land is your land, this land is my land," to the moment where we walked out with the first one, Hamid Darwish, when he was free, and out of nowhere everyone started shouting "Welcome home." I don't even know how they recognized who he was, but it was just this incredible moment of reaction in the best, most American way possible. And I don't know that we're there now. I just think we're in a different place now. And I don't mean that in a bad way at all. I just think in one way we're more exhausted. In one way it's more personal, right? I mean, we're all living this. And in addition to the communities we're fighting for, we all have our own, you know, stresses and fears that are being brought by all of this. We all have the, you know, people we know who are sick, possibly who are in the hospital. We're worried for our own health or one of our families. But I also think in some ways we're smarter, and we're more organized, and we're more educated about the issues. And so we're just responding in different ways. So I think the fact that, I mean, apart from the fact that you couldn't see us in the streets right now, even if we wanted to be, I don't think that that's not happening means it's less, it's just different.
So we have a little over 10 minutes left. I want to encourage people to get questions in. I'm talking to Carly Goodman and Camille Mackler about COVID-19 and about immigration on COVID calls. You can get your questions into YouTube Live or on Twitter. And Carly, we do have to attend to history. It's come up at multiple times in this conversation, but I wonder, do we have moments in American history where we've seen a pandemic or any kind of disaster used so aggressively in this mode as a point of division, as a point of singling out immigrants or taking action?
Yeah, I was trying to think about what you were going to ask me, and I have like no memory of anything that I've done, you know, more than a day ago. And people have been writing op-eds about this for us, and And clearly there's very good histories on sort of the treating immigrants as a vector of disease. Tons of that, of the way people are sort of screened and dehumanized at points of entry in our history. Maybe not pandemic, but I was thinking of sort of wartime as an opportunity that that forces within government have sort of seized as a chance to sort of try to shut things down. And I do think that they are almost always served by they're always almost seizing the opportunity to serve existing goals. So when I think about sort of the unwillingness of the United States to settle the St. Louis, in the 1930s, there were like forces in the State Department that were keeping those quotas unreached. 9/11 in our recent history, in my living history, as a time of like taking an opportunity to increase surveillance, to increase detention, to sort of normalize those kinds of technologies that are, have only increased in their use in the immigration enforcement system. What I was thinking about for you, Scott, was the success that the restrictionist movement has had in framing immigration itself as the crisis. And so seizing on images in 1980 of the Mariel boat lift, of people arriving, in this uncontrolled manner that maybe the public couldn't really necessarily parse, and conveying those images as a crisis that needs to be addressed with greater immigration restrictions. And we've seen that with the Haitian refugees in the early 90s, and those images of people on boats. And this idea that immigration itself is a crisis has also been the sort of the drumbeat of the immigration reforms that we've seen since the 90s, and sort of the failure of immigration since the 80s. Failure of the legislation has been devastating, but all of the enforcement priorities have marched on, secure in this idea that immigration has to be brought under control. And that logic seems to be enough to undergird a lot of policies that I think would have been very shocking to Americans in the 1980s. This idea of a mass deportation force moving through our communities and through our neighborhoods, a detention system on the scale that we have, these ICE deportation flights. These were things that when I go back and I read the debates in the 1980s, people are very wary of.
When you see language like Wuhan virus, then that to you dredges up tools and rhetorics that must have also accompanied these moments you're talking about, where the immigration wave or particular moment itself is framed as a kind of a disaster. But if you layer
an invasion or a
invasion
or a flood, the water metaphors in coverage of immigration are always quite triggering to me, because it's always a flood, a wave, a sort of disembodied, inhuman mass of people that is a threat to you, the reader. I actually want to let Camille talk, but the Spanish flu thing is sort of a great parallel to the Wuhan flu, which is that it was not Spanish. It was cast as Spanish, right? Because Spain was a neutral party in World War I, and they were the only ones talking about the pandemic outbreak and trying to do the responsible thing. And history has blamed them for more than 100 years. And it was convenient at first to sort of explain inaction, because the argument was that this was a matter of, the climate of Spain or the swarthiness of the Spanish people that made them susceptible to the influenza. And so those ideas and framing it as this foreign thing that isn't of us and isn't about us just prevented that much more, early assertive action that might have saved lives.
I guess people must have thought that, that sort of obvious racialization of the pandemic, and that those kind of tricks. And I think your idea, interestingly too, that war is a moment in which these similar kinds of moves are made against. I mean, I'm thinking of Japanese detention, and that somehow we were smarter than that, or we'd learned from history, or. And I guess I just have to ask you, your sense of this, because you must get asked this all the time. I mean, why have we not learned from those moments? Is something structural about our psychology in these moments that we grow fearful and therefore we just allow these kind of actions? Or have historians not been good enough communicators? But why are we? When I saw Wuhan virus, I had that same thought of Spanish flu. It wasn't a Spanish flu, it was an American flu. But what does it even matter? It's not a nationalist flu. It's a virus that's circulating around a world that's at war, but nationalizing it in some way. Shouldn't we have known better than that?
Very powerful forces are at work to make sure that we don't. Right? It's I can't say, oh, the public doesn't understand, when a lot of our politics is about exacerbating and fanning these flames, and a lot is poured into sort of tapping into the fault lines in our society. I think, yes, we need to write more op-eds, pitch me op-eds. Yes, historians are important, pay us salaries as professors so we can do important research, but we also just need a society where we, take care of each other and sort of recognize that that's the top priority, that we're all in this together and we have to take care of each other. And a basic social safety net that includes all of us. Yeah.
Camille, that was a very good pep talk for historians, Carly. I appreciate that. But Camille, you were touching on this earlier, talking about the airport protests and actions. But in this particular moment, how can people be allies in the work you're doing? How do we make solidarity in this particular moment? Most people don't have law degrees. They don't have the experience that you do. Many people are distant, or they feel that somehow they're distant from immigrant communities. How do we connect with this struggle?
I think, well, first of all, be cognizant, right? I mean, when you get food delivered to your door, maybe tip a little extra. Understand the challenges that they're facing now. If your child is being remote learning or anything like that, and you know that there's another child who may be struggling a little bit in your community, maybe reach out and I think just acts of welcome and acts of kindness and just of neighborly compassion go far. I think, I know we always say, call your elected officials, get them to include relief for immigrants in the upcoming relief package that's being negotiated right now, COVID-4 or whatever they're calling it. That, and do that at the local level too. And get involved. I mean, get involved with the local advocacy group, sign up for their listserv, find out what's happening. A lot of times we put action alerts on our social media or whatnot. I mean, I think the more we can talk about it and the more we can sort of educate each other as to what the issues really are, the more I think a lot of what happens with this immigration is the fear, right? There's the obvious barriers, like there's the cultural barriers and the language barriers, and there's just things that seem so daunting. But once you get over it, I mean, volunteer to be able to teach someone to learn English so that they can become a US citizen, just be a conversation partner, things like that just go so far. And I think what we need to do is we just need to have a real conversation, a real honest conversation about immigration in this country. And that's not happening. And the Trump administration and people who think that way are able to exploit the lack of knowledge and the lack of understanding of the core issues to sow this fear and to really promote it. When you get to know somebody as a human being, you realize they're not that scary at all.
I just want to get one last question in to both of you, and that's to where else can we look to see countries that maybe are doing better than the United States at this right now? Countries where the immigration policies are maybe better, but also in this particular moment and under the stress of the pandemic, where countries you're not seeing the kinds of actions that we're seeing in the United States that are stigmatizing and damaging immigrant communities.
Early on, I saw a story about Portugal, where everyone's status was sort of regularized temporarily, or for the purposes of whatever their relief package was. But I don't have on the ground, corroboration of how great that's going. It just sounded pretty great when I saw it.
Mhm.
And I think, you know, a lot of the problems we're having here are problems elsewhere. In some places, quite violent, aggressive responses to migrant communities. And like the forces that I was talking about of sort of white power and white nationalism are also transnational forces that have been, activating the far right in so many of these European countries. I don't know that we have a lot of great examples.
Yeah, Camille, do you have any place in mind? You're shaking your head.
Not really. I mean, I think Europe just generally, because of their healthcare system and stuff, has probably been more welcoming by default, but I can't think of any place that's been overtly, except for, I guess, for the nation state of California, which has made a lot of investments in immigrant communities. But
So I guess I said that was the last question, but I actually have one more little question, which is, how do you think this pandemic is going to change the way we do this kind of work and research?
I think it's going to change how we connect.
Yeah.
And I think that's for the better. We're communicating more in a way, right? Our own internal borders have been brought down. And I think that that's probably a good thing.
That's interesting. Carly, from the perspective of history, I mean, we're supposed to be working with old sources, but there's a lot of new sources being generated every day. I mean, have you had a chance to think about this yet?
I think it really depends how this recovery goes. Like if we can get the testing, if we can, create a society with more robust support than we had before. There's a lot of hunger for healthcare, right? There's a lot of recognition that our old fragilities have left us, especially vulnerable to this, and that has had real human costs. So if we can sort of build on all of the movements that have been trying to bring these issues to people's, attention, and all of the people who are newly aware of them, if we can sort of change our, the very structure of our society. So just a simple, in my simple two-step project, change the structure of society. I think that's going to really shape the answer to your question, because there's a very real likelihood that all of the history departments, with the exception of a few Ivy League ones, will cease to exist in the next several years, right? We're going to see a transformation of higher ed as we know it that could be quite devastating, because we haven't necessarily invested in the things that we value and that are important. I mean, we talked about that at the beginning of this call. It's also true in all areas of American life. The things that make life joyful and worth living, I think, are worth rebuilding, and the things that the sort of the structures that can allow us to bring our individual gifts and our treasures to bear on these, like on the tough questions and challenges that are before us. You mentioned earlier the idea of, well, what if a foreign-born person who came and got their PhD here in the United States is kicked out because they eliminate OPT and there's no visas for them, and then they don't have a chance to work in that lab and develop the vaccine for this very pandemic. I think there's so many people whose treasures we haven't cultivated, and we haven't honored. And so letting people sort of have the opportunity to live their best life, that seems to be, that's like a very old-fashioned idea about what the American dream is, but I think it might be the best of it.
I want to remind people that you've been listening to COVID Calls, and tomorrow I'm going to be talking to Don Kettle at 5 o'clock about American federalism. So please rejoin me for that. And I really want to thank Camille Mackler and Carly Goodman for this really rich conversation. And obviously we really have much more to say about this. So I hope I can get a chance to speak to you both again. Thanks for coming on COVID Calls.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay healthy, everyone, and we'll talk to you tomorrow at 5 o'clock. Thank you.